Stardust Crusaders is a major turning point for the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and this is because of the introduction of stands, a whole new power system in the world of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I've said before that with Araki, when it comes to creativity in his fights, I think that's one of the key strengths that he has in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, just making some very creative fights. And with Araki introducing stands into part 3, he removed a lot of the restrictions that he had with the Ripple. He was able to make just about every fight entertaining, and that is definitely due to the large variety of abilities when it comes to the stands. It was a very risky move, but it definitely paid off in the long run. My only problem with this part though is that there's just way too many fights, at least to me. It feels like it dragged on for a bit too long. It definitely could have been a bit more condensed, or yeah, just a bit shorter. But overall, I can appreciate everything that Araki introduced with the stands, because yeah, he did not hold himself back. He didn't set any restrictions. I mean, when you just take a look at every one of the stands in this part, it's just flat out crazy. You have dogs and birds facing off with each other. They have stands. You see a fly that is a stand, a sword that is a stand, a woman that uses magnets as a stand, magnetism, something like that, I think. There's two different pairs of brothers. One of the pairs can predict the future, and the other pair uses video games and gambling to take their opponent's souls. And let's not forget the orangutan whose stand is a ship. So yeah, I think I'm gonna just pretty much say this throughout every video I make on JoJo's, but Araki and his creativity, it's his strong suit. But that's one of the first things I really just want to address and get out of the way with Stardust Crusaders. It's just a very super important thing to this part, and something that made Stardust Crusaders so entertaining. But looking more so at the narrative side of this, I really loved the cast of characters. We got Jotaro, Joseph, Abdul, Kakuin, and Polnareff. In parts 1 and 2, I saw that a lot of the focus was mainly put on the main antagonist and, the protagonist. In Stardust Crusaders, that's obviously, a big part of the story, but another big part was, just the side characters. Just seeing how all the characters build off each other, not just the protagonist and antagonist. That's something that I saw Araki really play into in this part. It definitely led to some very enjoyable characters. I also just love seeing the return of Joseph in this part, and, especially an older Joseph, because the Joseph in part 2 and the Joseph in Stardust Crusaders, they feel so different from each other. I loved Polnareff, like I've already said, but I just loved his whole character arc throughout part 3. At first, he wants to get revenge for his little sister, but as he spends time with, Kakuin, Abdul, Joseph, Jotaro, he starts to really grow as a character. It's because of the people he meets and becoming friends with some of the characters in this part, he's able to stand up to one of the strongest people in the world of JoJo's. I was also just very surprised that a side character got, just so much attention throughout the story. Now, moving on to the protagonist of Stardust Crusaders, Jotaro Kujo. How I pretty much described him is a silent hero. He seems pretty rude and, he can do some mean things or say some mean stuff. He has that whole delinquent vibe to him, and most of the time he seems to be quiet. But throughout the story, he just goes along and he doesn't do anything for recognition or approval or anything like that. He doesn't seem egotistical. As with someone like Joseph, at least in part 2, Joseph really did feel like, a very egotistical person. I felt like Joseph, at least in part 2, he had a lot of arrogance with him. But with Jotaro, I didn't see anything like that with him. I find Jotaro to be very calm and collected. I think even near the end where Jotaro and Dio fight, Dio says that Jotaro has incredible composure, and yeah, I really think that's a perfect word to describe Jotaro. He's pretty much the embodiment of composure. I do think he could see that as boring because, he doesn't react to stuff as much as other characters would, especially if you just compare him to the last part, Joseph. You just might find Jotaro to be boring, but for me, I found his composure and staying calm and collected, I found it to be just very entertaining. what really makes that work is definitely the side characters, because most of the time they're the ones going and reacting to everything around them, while Jotaro always is just calm. The next thing I want to talk about would be the fights. I guess to get specific with this, I really enjoyed how strategic the fights were. I felt that in this part, there were a few more layers added to each fight. Not everything was solely determined on how powerful a stand was or how much strength a stand had. One of the first things you would have to find out would be what the ability of the stand is. And then you could try and, counterattack and stuff like that. But even if you do figure it out, you still might have to figure out who the user is, or else you could really get into some big trouble. And so just having to figure out those two things, it added so much to each and every fight. It added a whole new layer of strategy. The fights just made this part so great. One of the last things I want to talk about is Dio. He's a returning antagonist, and what I found really interesting is that he didn't really appear throughout the story. I mean, there were a couple times we see him, but for the most part, he never really, fights the characters throughout Stardust Crusaders. And it's only at the very end that we actually see him in action. And Araki really just saving Dio for the final battle, and seeing what he does to, the characters that we've been following throughout the story, it just added such high stakes to the final battle. Seeing his stand, his power, the world, it was really an amazing thing to see at the end of this story. And I think Araki used Dio very well. Something that this part really showed is that Dio has a whole lot of charisma, and that's evident because of all the amount of people working for him. I think something that every antagonist needs is probably a bit of arrogance, and that's something that Dio has a whole lot of. Just having Dio making it his destiny to fight the Joestar bloodline, fight the Joestar family, it's something that added a whole lot to the final battle of Stardust Crusaders. And having him have a super crazy power, it made the final battle very impactful. I could tell that Araki evolved writing Stardust Crusaders, whether it be in his art or in his story, and yeah, just his whole power system. It really just took the entirety of JoJo's up a notch. So yeah, I'm very excited to read Diamond is Unbreakable. That's one of my favorite parts from the anime. Also, I did see that JOJO Lands, the first chapter of that, came out. So yeah, I'm very excited to, read that and be a part of the community for that, because, the first few parts of JoJo's, they were written all the way back in, the 80s and 90s. So once I'm done making videos on all the other parts, I'm gonna be very excited, really engaging in, the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure community. That's really what I'm trying to do with all these reviews on each of these parts. But for now, that's everything I wanted to say. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one, and peace.